Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Kanawi, Marketing Manager for Egypt, Europe at the American University in Cairo Press. And thank you for joining us today for our virtual book discussion of Luxor Illustrated, the revised and updated edition with Aswan, Abu Simbel, and the Nile. It was originally written by Michael Haag, who passed away sadly in 2020. And this edition has been updated and with a new introduction written by our guest speaker today, Dr. Aidan Dodson. Our event today will be for about 1 hour, and we're going to have room for some Q&A at the end. So if you want to ask any questions, please type them in the Q&A box so we don't miss them. And if you're joining our Facebook page, you'll be able to ask also questions if you write them in the comment section, and we'll ask them on your behalf. So Luxor Illustrated is a full color guide to the monuments and landscape of Upper Egypt. It starts with Luxor, the site of ancient Egypt, Thebes, the capital of the New Kingdom, with all of its marvelous pharaonic monuments there, which justifies its reputation as the greatest outdoor museum in the world. The book also covers all major sites of Upper Egypt, including Abydos, Dendera, Esna, Edfu, and Kom Ombo. And there's also special attention given to Aswan and the remarkable temples at Abu Simbel. This edition, as mentioned before, is now fully revised and updated by the leading Egyptologist Aidan Dodson, and it's presented in a new brand format and design that's easily portable, and it's perfect companion when you visit Upper Egypt famed site and monuments. The book is due to be released 1st of October, so you can still pre-order it from different purchasing links, which I'm gonna paste in the chat box. And we're honored, as usual, to have our guest speaker today, Dr. Aidan Dodson, who is the Honorary Full Professor of Egyptology in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Bristol, UK. He is also Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo back in 2013, and he was the chair of Egypt Exploration Society between 2011 and 2016. He's awarded his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2003, and he was elected as a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 2003. He's the author of some 30 books, and we're quite honored to have some of them published by AUC Press. And please join me in welcoming him. And now I'll leave the floor to him.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. Nice to be here. In my case, late afternoon in Bristol in the UK, later in the evening in Cairo, and early in the morning on the other side of the Atlantic. So anyway, let me first of all share my screen so hopefully that will all work. Okay, let me just do a couple of little adjustments for things before I actually get started, so that I'm not sort of mucking around with buttons and things while that. Okay, so what I'm going to start off with is say a few words about the process of revising this book, and then what I'm going to do is take you on a tour of Luxor. As Suzanne mentioned, the book actually covers all the Upper Egyptian sites, but I thought, given the sheer amount of material in Luxor, I thought it would be better just to have a little bit of a tour of Luxor, rather than sort of try and sort of spread myself over the whole of Upper Egypt. The images I'm going to be showing in the lecture are a mixture of my own and also some of those which are in the book as well. So it's really a mixture of the two, depending on really what I'm trying to sort of talk about at a given moment. I say the job of revising a book by a deceased predecessor is always quite an interesting and quite challenging process, because on one hand, you want to try and bring it up to date. On the other hand, you've got to try, you actually want it to still be the book which it originally was. There's could be a terrible temptation in many ways to change all the pictures, change all the words, to make it sort of my vision of Upper Egypt rather than Michael Haag's. And so I didn't want to do that. So what I tried to do in revising the book was to, first of all, pick up things which were no longer current. As many of you know, Luxor and many other sites have changed fundamentally over the past past 20 years or so, if not longer. I think the first time I came to Luxor was actually 40 years ago, almost to the day. And I was discussing that with somebody who I came there with back in 1984, how much things fundamentally changed. So some things which have really changed, I did actually change in a big way. For example, the section on Luxor Museum included a whole thing on objects from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which were then in Luxor Museum, but no longer are. They've now, of course, been moved to Cairo for the Grand Egyptian Museum. So that part had to be rewritten and re-illustrated as well. In other places, things have changed, but not so much as to require new photos. For example, the facade of Luxor Temple here. Strictly speaking, I suppose I should have changed all the pictures showing it with just the two colossal statues to the one with all the ones re-erected. But that was again probably taking a step too far from the point of view of trying to maintain it as Michael Haag's book rather than Aidan Dodson's book. There are a couple of places where there had been mistakes made in the setting up of the book originally. There was a couple of places where the captions didn't actually reflect what the actual pictures were. This is the sort of thing which always seems to happen in book production. And in those particular cases, I either changed the captions to reflect the images or vice versa, where given which was the more important thing. And there were, say, various other little bits and pieces, as people have probably heard me say in the past, ancient Egyptian history is a movable feast. That things which we thought were perfectly good history 20 years ago have now been overtaken. So in those cases, I've also tweaked the wording and so on and so forth. But I hope that at the end of the day, it's still Michael Haag's book, but just with, say, various tweaks here and there to ensure that there are no actual errors. There are no things which are just simply not as they are anymore. But say leaving a few images which sort of the hard liner might say, well, that's sort of, doesn't look quite like that. But I think it's only really where things have changed, so fundamentally changed, that they're no longer recognisable, that I've actually gone so far as to replace Michael Haag's original photographs. So having said that, what I want to do for the rest of this evening, next hour or so, is to take you on a tour of Luxor. Some of the things which if I'm doing it actually in person, I would be highlighting to people, and say, illustrate with a mixture of my images and some of Haag's images, to give you, and all of which give us the same sort of feel of what the book is, which I think is it's really intended as effectively in many ways a souvenir as well as a guide for those who are visiting Upper Egypt, which again, as Suzanne has said, and is often held up almost as a cliche, but it's perfectly true, the world's greatest open-air museum. To start off with, where are we talking about? Well, I think that's fairly obvious. This is the area which the book actually covers, from Abydos through down to Aswan. But where we're going to be focusing this afternoon is here, in the middle part of that, the area of modern Luxor, ancient Thebes. And I'll probably be using the terms Thebes and Luxor fairly interchangeably. The problem is, although the whole of the area is Luxor in modern terms, archaeologically we tend to still talk about Luxor being the East Bank, and the West Bank, with its whole myriad of different sites, is the Western Thebes or Thebes West. So that's the sort of terminology, but probably I won't be necessarily being totally consistent in this. Anyway, so here is what I'm going to call Thebes, embracing both banks. On the East Bank, you have got the modern city and the two great temple complexes, that of Karnak in the north and Luxor in the south, joined together by a and anciently and now modernly, in over the last decade or so, by an avenue of sphinxes running along here down to Luxor. And then on the west bank, the wide area of cultivated land with a number of villages which have grown up here, including and buildings growing up along the main road going here. Though interestingly, I recently inherited some photographs taken back in the 1960s, and effectively there is absolutely nothing here at all, where all the villages, houses, and so on are simply gone away, and those were taken about 60 years ago. And so, an example of how a landscape can fundamentally change over that kind of time. And then over here on the west bank, we have the string of royal memorial temples belonging to the kings of the New Kingdom running along here. And then including also the Temple of Der el-Bahri up here. Then the Valley of the Queen, the various hills of Drabul Naga, Sheikh Abdel Kurna, and Gudat Murai, housing the tomb chapels of nobles, mainly of the New Kingdom, but also some of the Saite period and some going back as far as the Old Kingdom. And then the workman's village at Der el-Medina. And then finally out here, the Valley of the Kings. And we'll be having a brief stop at all of these various locations this evening. Starting off here on the east bank, here we see the two temple complexes with the avenue of sphinxes cutting through the modern city here and paralleling with the railway station. And here we've got you looking from the west bank over here at one of the various landing points over to where Luxor Temple is. So we're just looking across here and seeing how the temple runs along the waterfront. And actually, it's interesting to note the fact that it runs north-south in contrast to most Egyptian temples, which are east-west. And that is all part of the way that it ties in with the processional route, which runs from Karnak down southwards during the Feast of Opet, one of the great festivals of the ancient Theban year. And the Luxor Temple is very much a part of that whole thing, with parts of the decoration highlighting its role in the Opet festival. In addition to the actual monuments, the ancient monuments, we have modern monuments as well. For example, the Winter Palace Hotel opened in 1902, one of the great hotels of Egypt. It's probably part of this sort of holy trinity of the Mina House at Giza, the Cataract at Aswan, and then we have the Winter Palace here. And probably another sort of a fourth member, if you like, is probably the Cecil Hotel in Alexandria. So if one is feeling reasonably well off, the idea of sort of spending a trip which spends a night or two at each of these great hotels is quite something. Just worth pointing out that it opened in 1902, in spite of the fact that its restaurant is called the 1886, which sort of implies that it sort of is that old, but it isn't. Much as one would like to think of it as being a 19th century, is actually early 20th century hotel. Not that it sort of suffers from that at all. It's still one of my favourite places to hang out in Luxor. Then here we have the temple which actually gives the whole city its name, El Luxor, which means the castles, and really the focus of that is that of the Temple of Luxor. Here's the pylon as erected by Rameses II, as it is today. As I mentioned in the introduction, nowadays it has these additional 4 colossal statues, which were re-erected in recent years by the Antiquities Service. But the photographs in the book are those of Haag, which reflect it when it just had these two colossi in place. Here we have the obelisk, and here the one which used to be here, which was taken away by the French, having been given to them by the governor Muhammad Ali back in 1832. Rather sadly, because it was the only temple with both obelisks still in place, and it has been described as like an elephant with one tusk missing, but that's simply how it is. And then we look along the axis and note here the oddities of the temple, partly to do with the topography of the site, is that it actually changes axis slightly in the middle. Normally, when you're looking through the entrance of a temple, you are looking straight through into the right away through to the sanctuary. Here, however, the Rameses II element diverts slightly because of the topography of the land and the need to link up with the processional route from Karnak, where it is placed in front of the original temple, which was built by Amenhotep III. So here we can see that slight deviation here of the Rameses II element of it. And here beyond, the huge temple of Amenhotep III, one of the best preserved purely 18th dynasty temples in Egypt, with this wonderful colonnade hall in the middle, left unfinished by Amenhotep, but finished off by his grandson, Tutankhamun. One of the most striking things about Luxor Temple is the fact that it's still a place of worship. Here in the forecourt is the Mosque of Abu Simbel, towering above the main courtyard, simply because this is where the debris had come up to when the mosque was built in medieval times. But I always think it's quite striking because we know that, of course, we have originally the ancient Egyptian cults here, then there was a church on the site, and then this mosque. So here we've got a way to experience over 3,000 years of religious devotion, all in one location. And from the mosque, one gets a beautiful view looking back along the temple, the colonnade hall here, the so-called sun court, and back into the sanctuary area. In the other direction, leading out of the temple, we see the beginnings of the Sphinx Avenue, which runs northwards, ultimately ending up at Karnak. The processional way goes back at least to the early New Kingdom, possibly even as far back as the Middle Kingdom. We simply don't know. Our evidence really only goes back to the early 18th dynasty. But most of the sphinxes which line the part between the Luxor Temple and the beginning of the Karnak complex were all installed much, much later by Nectanebo I, one of the very last native pharaohs during the 4th century BC. And the Sphinx Avenue then continues northwards. This is a photograph taken while it was still under excavation, so not quite as pristine as it is today. Showing the way that the excavation has cut a huge swathe through the centre of Luxor, which I think there are mixed views on. Some admire the fact that we've opened up the ancient cityscape. Others, particularly some people people who live there, and those of us who sort of been travelling there for a long time, in some ways think it's rather sort of undermines the charm of what a lot of Luxor was, with the winding streets and so on, which used to be in this particular location. And then, as we carry on northwards, we end up being confronted by the amazing complex of the Karnak temples. This is where the Sphinx Avenue comes in here from Luxor for a couple of kilometers to the south, and here the avenue splits off into one route, which goes through into the Temple of Khonsu, one of the number of sub-temples of the Karnak complex. Then runs off eastwards to this point, whereby there is a route into the Temple of Mut, the consort of Ammon, the god whose temple is primarily is. And then we have another much earlier Sphinx Avenue, ram-headed sphinxes installed there by Tutankhamun, which run up to the southernmost entrance to the main temple here, the 10th of the 10 pylon entrances to the temple complex. And then here we have the actual original, the main temple, originally begun in the Middle Kingdom. There's sort of scanty remains of the Middle Kingdom temple there, and then gradually extended both eastwards and westwards over the coming centuries, and also with a further south wing added in the early 18th dynasty, and then adorned with pylons by Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, and Amenhotep III, and Horemheb on this side as well. It's worthwhile bearing in mind that when the temple was first built in Middle Kingdom times, this area where the temple was an island in the Nile. Then gradually it silted up, joining the temple to the east bank. And then over the centuries, the temple has expanded this way as the Nile has retreated. So that some really important remote sensing work has allowed us to trace the way that the temple has expanded westwards. That in the 22nd dynasty, i.e. the 10th century BC, the river was running here. It now runs at least 500 meters further off to the west. And when you visit the temple today, one sometimes wonders why certain areas are very, very congested, why there's a gateway within a few feet of the next one almost. Well, it's because actually when the obelisks and pylon gateways were made here during the middle of the 18th dynasty by Thutmose I, III, and Hatshepsut, well, the river was here. So they couldn't really do very much more. But then, as it moved backwards, the hypostyle hall could be built by Seti I, the forecourt could be built by Shoshenq I, and so on and so forth. So there's some the topography of this site is really interesting, and it does show how huge amounts of information can be obtained by simply drill cores. So in some ways, some of the most important work carried out ever at Karnak was simply using an auger rather than by actually really sort of what most people would regard as being excavation. And so here we are. We're looking actually along the approach to the temple from the south with these ram-headed sphinxes, say erected by Tutankhamun, but actually constructed from cannibalized effectively of sphinxes which had previously been of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, which had formed part of the by then demolished temples of the Aten at Karnak. And they were effectively decapitated. The heads of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were removed, and new sandstone heads of rams were added. This is rather an antique shot because it's still got the crane visible here, which was used in the restoration of the 9th pylon and was a feature of the Karnak skyline until only a couple of years ago when it was finally dismantled. So that's the southern entrance, but the main entrance, the one through which visitors, except for will enter today, is on the east side, on the west side of the temple, with this great pylon, which was built somewhere probably during the reigns of one of the Nectanebos of the 30th dynasty, or possibly even an early Ptolemy. We've got no basis for absolutely dating it, and it was never actually finished. And actually, on the other side of it, there still remains of the mud brick ramps, which were being used to build the thing in the first place. But still, it makes a remarkable facade to the temple. And here, just a bit of plan, just showing some of the features which I showed on the aerial photograph earlier on. Here, you've got the main axis, the southern axis. Running off, here's the Sphinx Avenue to to Luxor, and here we've got the Mut temple over here, and also the temple of Monchu over here. And it's worthwhile noting, and also the temple of Khonsu. So although it's fundamentally a temple of Amun, it's also a temple, almost a national shrine in many ways, because within the temple complex, in addition to the triad of Thebes, Amun, his wife Mut, and his son Khonsu, we also have a temple of the Memphite god Ptah, chapels of various forms of Osiris, and so on and so forth. So very much reflecting its role in the New Kingdom, particularly as a national shrine. Zooming in to the main part of the temple, the Amun element of it. Here again, we can see the Khonsu temple out here. The core of the temple, as already said, was built by the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, and then it gradually expanded this way under the Thutmosids, then made a great leap forward by the building of this temple, the Pylon 2 by Horemheb. Seti I fills in the hypostyle hall. Shoshenq I then adds the first courtyard. And then the eastern part of the temple, which is actually a temple of the sun. It's not a temple so much of a moon. And even further to the east was Akhenaten's temple. Here we're looking down from the first pylon into the first courtyard, say the courtyard itself, the work of Shoshenq I, the rather tumble down second pylon of Horemheb, and the hypostyle hall beyond. And you can just see one of the great obelisks of Hatshepsut poking out here. And in the foreground, what we've got is this great colonnade, which was erected by the 25th dynasty Nubian pharaoh Taharqa. The hypostyle hall, even for somebody who has been traveling to Egypt and Luxor for over 40 years, is still spectacular. And this is actually a more recent photograph, because it actually shows some of the colors which have been recently revealed by ongoing conservation work in the hall, and also some of the little vistas one can get of some of the of Seti I on the back of the second pylon, peeking between some of these these great columns. And then the sheer size of this whole thing, it's still something which has a wow factor, even if one has visited this temple literally hundreds of times. And then here we look from the other end. This is looking at it from the eastern side, looking back. You can see the pylon, the first pylon just in the distance here. The festival hall of Thutmose III here. Again, just saying something about the sheer size of it. And also we can just see peeking here in the distance are the hills of the West Bank. And the West Bank is now where we're going to cross over to. There was always an important relationship between Karnak and the West Bank. And there is a sight line between Deir el-Bahri and the main axis of Karnak, which is certainly cannot be any kind of can't be fortuitous. And other temples, for example, the temple of Kurna here of Seti I also is aligned with it, and a number of the tombs up here have clearly been oriented so you can see there's a couple of places, particularly some on the higher reaches of Jabal Naga, for example. One gets an amazing view almost straight down the axis of the Karnak temple, albeit a couple of kilometers away, but that's all intentional. And also, we've already talked about this processional way from Luxor to Karnak for the Opet festival. We know there are other festivals which took place, including the beautiful Feast of the Valley, in which Amun crossed over to the West Bank and would go and visit the various memorial temples along here before returning back to the East Bank. And the location of many of the private tomb chapels high on the cliffs overlooking the edge of the cultivation here are clearly part of a desire by the dead to participate in these festivals. So one has to recognize that the whole site is very much an integrated whole, and that one should actually see how these various buildings relate to one another. It's also, we can also see in some places where the memorial temples of certain kings are aligned so that their axes come very, very close to the location of their tombs and the Valley of the Kings as well. So we have to look at the whole of Thebes as being an integrated whole with the temples, tombs, all at least many of them in some way relating to one another over the centuries, even indeed millennia, during which the whole area develops. So, in particular, we have this axis running from Karnak to Deir el-Bahri, and here we can actually see this beautifully. Here we are standing just in front of the Karnak temple, and on a rather beautifully clear day like this, one can see straight into the temple. One might say, well, it's not actually, it's a slight angle, but given ancient surveying methods and everything else, it's pretty good. And here we are, just looking from the Winter Palace, on the from the front of Winter Palace, looking across to the hills of the West Bank, where over millennia, probably on the aggregate of millions of people found their eternal rest. With these, though, the various parts of the hills visible here, for example, this is where the Deir el-Bahri is, Drabul Naga, and behind here, the site of the Valley of the Kings. And here, the remote so-called southern wadis, long unexplored or largely unexplored, apart from a few hardy. But now a long-term project is working down there and is revealing all kinds of things, including what seems to be the long-lost tomb of Thutmose II. Anyway, let's zoom in on the West Bank, with all the memorial temples running along here, including the Deir el-Bahri, and down here the great temple, the great temple and palace complex of Malkata, built by Amenhotep III, and in pretty well in a line of sight going across to the Luxor temple. So again, the links between the East and West banks are really quite important. This aerial photograph of the West Bank shows how things are rather nicely, with the green cultivated fields, and then we can see the various remains of memorial temples running on here. And it's a good place where one gets the dichotomy between what the ancient Egyptians called the red land and the black land. The black land, the fertile floodplain in ancient times, in fact down into the 1960s, fertilized by the black silt brought down from Ethiopia and deposited on fields, and then the red land, the dry desert, where one can quite happily stand with 1 foot in somebody's growing fields and 1 foot in the desert. So a nice the contrast between the red land and the black land there. And here we have the temples of Deir el-Bahri. First of all, the earliest of the temples on the West Bank, that of Montuhotep II, the founder of the Middle Kingdom in the 11th dynasty. And then next to it, the temple of Hatshepsut, clearly inspired by its terraced form, but erected centuries later, as we see here. And then in between, almost completely demolished by a rock fall sometime in probably the 21st dynasty, a temple of Thutmose III. Again, approached by ramps with the long approach here from the valley. The temple of Hatshepsut here is the earliest surviving, or at least well-preserved version of a New Kingdom memorial temple, which, unlike the temples attached to the pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, which were dedicated to both, just primarily to the dead king, this is dedicated to Ammon, a local version of Ammon, also to Reharachti, the sun god, Anubis, and Hathor, as well as the female king Hatshepsut herself. And here we're looking up the main axis of it. These colonnades, which are such a striking feature of the temple of Hatshepsut. In the center line here, this is where we have the chapel of Ammon. Over here is the chapel of Hatshepsut, Reharachti here. And here on the various terraces, we have depictions of a range of things. Some of them are ritual scenes, but others are scenes from the career of the female king, Hatshepsut. And it's important to recognize that these temples, these memorial temples, are the equivalents of the tomb chapels of the nobles, which contain the scenes of the nobles' lives, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And in the same way, this does as well, except that what a king gets up to is rather different from what a noble does. So here we have scenes of the great expedition to Punt, somewhere on the wet Red Sea coast. We have scenes of transport of obelisks as part of the furnishings of the Luxor of the Karnak temple, which is an important part of what Hatshepsut did. But we've also got scenes of her daily life, or at least recreation. There are scenes of her hunting and fishing in the marshes, a range of other things. And then at the other extreme, her divine birth, and other sort of ritual scenes as well. So a very, very richly adorned set of elements of the temple. And just here, we can see that here, just annotated. And if I may be printed, this image actually comes from a book which is due out from AUC Press in the new year. My latest book in the series, Lives and Afterlives, which is dedicated to Thutmose III and Hatshepsut. So here we can just see the sort of range of different kinds of images, and also this spectrum of dedications which we find in just one single temple. And in this, it's typical of the memorial temples of the New Kingdom, although only a couple of those are sufficiently well preserved, whereby we can actually see this is also true in their case as well. This is the chapel of Hatshepsut herself, with the great false door at the back. Now, this room had a long and varied history. The cult of Hatshepsut probably lasted only for 20 years before she was cancelled on the orders of Thutmose III. But then many centuries later, it became a chapel of Amenhotep, son of Harpu, the deified official of Amenhotep III. And then even later, it became a church. And actually on the effaced false door of Hatshepsut, a figure of Christ in glory was painted. So again, rather like when I was talking about Luxor Temple, how there's a continuity to these places, this is again somewhere which saw a number of different cult foci. Here's the sanctuary of Amun, with the innermost part of which was taken over by Amenhotep, son of Harpu, and Imhotep for their worship during the Ptolemaic period. And then we've got the altar of the Sun Court as well. So again, the Hatshepsut temple, although we tend to think about it as an 18th dynasty monument, is a monument which extends right the way through into the 10th or 11th century AD, when it was still part of a functioning monastery. The chapel of Hathor. Hathor was particularly prominent at Deir el-Bahri, and when he built his temple, it's now almost totally demolished one, this slightly higher level next to it. Thutmose III included a Hathor shrine in that as well, and we have evidence for the cult of Hathor here going on for centuries. Then moving along to the south, we have got ruins of various other memorial temples of kings of the New Kingdom, most of which are terribly ruined. And even the famous Ramesseum, which is again an important, important place to visit today, is in very, very poor condition, with only the very tumble down first pylon, some little bits of the hypostyle hall and so on surviving, but also this huge area of mud brick buildings, which were part of its role as an economic place. The pharaohs, some nobles, would often leave fields and other resources to fund their cults, their ongoing cults, and these are storehouses in which the grain and other things coming from the fields belonging to the Ramesseum complex were housed. Also, it later on became an administrative centre of the West Bank as well. So, which is probably one of the things which contributed to some of the stonework surviving, because it had a role beyond simply that of a memorial temple to a king. And quite often these memorial temples went out of use fairly soon after the death of a king. Only a few kings were remembered to a level whereby cults were maintained for decades or centuries. For example, here, this area here, which it looks absolutely desolate, is actually remains the memorial temple of Thutmose IV, with a 25th dynasty private tomb chapel then built on top of it. But still, you know, even in its ruined state, the Ramesseum is an impressive place. And in some cases, actually, picturesque ruins are rather more attractive to the visitor, particularly the casual visitor, than something more intact. So, again, still, in spite of its terribly ruined state, one can profitably spend a couple of hours wandering around the ruins of the temple. And of course, it has this great, this huge now collapsed colossus, has a place in modern European literature, in that it is the Ozymandias, King of Kings, in the sonnet written by Shelley. I met a traveller from an antique land, and so on and so forth. So these places again have ancient significance, but also they have inspired things in much more modern times. And then probably the best preserved of the memorial temples on the West Bank, here we've got the Temple of Medinet Habu, the memorial temple of Rameses III, but also including other structures as well, including a Temple of Amun here, which goes back to the early 18th dynasty, with possibly some remains on the site going back as far as the Middle Kingdom. The entrance to the whole the complex is impressive. This is the so-called Migdol Gateway, erected by Rameses III when he built his memorial temple here. It is in the form of a Palestinian or Syrian fortress, and presumably is that part of a reflection of his military activity here, with scenes of him smiting enemies here. And also the rest of the gateway formed a palace for him, in which it may be he was murdered. We know now that his throat was cut, and we have records of the trials, those accused of the conspiracy which killed him. And it seems likely that the murder either happened in this palace on this side of the temple, or another one which is on the other side of the temple altogether. Here we are looking through the through entering the Migdol Gateway, looking through to the facade of the main temple. And then here, further inside the temple, we're looking in through along one of the colonnades, which surround the various courtyards. So here we have the complex. So there's Rameses III's temple, the Temple of the Moon, and so there are various other cult buildings, the tomb chapels from God's Wives of the Moon, even a pharaoh's tomb. At least a local pharaoh was buried here as well. And then we move, if we move back northwards, we find the biggest temple built on the West Bank, and indeed one of the biggest single temples built in the whole of Egypt, the Temple of Amenhotep III, which extends into what is now the cultivated land, although it was built on an area of gravel, which allowed it, at least in ancient times, to be above the levels of the Nile flood, of which only a few elements survive. And indeed, when Michael Haag wrote his book, all that one could see of it were two great colossal statues here, and a few traces of this inner part. In more recent times, the labours of Sarusian, her dedicated team, have managed to rediscover fallen statues and start to restore Amenhotep III's complex to something of its original splendour. And so here we have those, what for many, many years were the sole markers of the temple of Amenhotep III, the so-called Colossi of Memnon, actually erected by Amenhotep III, made of quartzite, quarried actually just outside Cairo airport. So in contrast to most major stones which were quarried upstream of the site, these great blocks had to be brought upstream, all the way from Cairo to here, which certainly would be quite an achievement. Called of Memnon, owing to the identification of this one with the classical hero Memnon in Greek times, which in fact it's only this one which was Memnon, but now we call it the Colossi of Memnon. The two have been taken together because of damage in a earthquake, which actually felled the whole upper part of it. At dawn, it sometimes made a singing noise. This was recorded as being heard by the Emperor Hadrian. But then when it failed to sing for the Empress of Septimius Severus, he commissioned the body to be assembled and the head to put back on it. But the restoration then silenced Memnon forever. And here we are just looking up at the Colossus, one at the left-hand Colossus. But then here, looking up at another one, this is one which, when Haag wrote the book, and for millennia probably prior to that, which had been lost, completely buried under the soil, is this one from the second pylon, which has now been re-erected by Dr. Sarusian, so that we can now actually see the way that this temple progresses from the outer colossi through a series of smaller colossi into the core of the temple, of which the so-called Sun Court is here, again with various elements which have been re-erected by Dr. Sarusian's expedition. Although we're still only looking at the very lowest courses of some of these things, and it just shows how what was once probably one of the most spectacular temples on the West Bank could be completely lost. It seems that the major problem was an earthquake which took place within a few decades of his death, and by the time of Meremptah, the son of Rameses II, only a century later, that blocks from here were being reused in his memorial temple. Then the counterparts of the memorial temple to the kings, which was recognised the memorial temples of the kings are an integral part of the overall funerary complex. So it's not just simply the temples, but also it is the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which we'll be looking at in a moment. But here, for the nobility of the New Kingdom, and also some of the Middle Kingdom, and sometimes late in the Saite period, this is the equivalence. These are their memorial temples. These chapels cut in the rock, and both the memorial temple and the tomb chapel was the place where the two worlds of the dead and the living came together. These were open to the public. This is where people would come to say prayers for the deceased, make offerings to them, or generally sort of commune with them in general. Also, the decoration of these chapels, which showed many cases food production, were also to generate the food which was desired by the dead for their long-term survival in the next world. And then generally underneath these chapels is where the people were actually buried. Unlike the pharaohs of the period who had their tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but their memorial temples overlooking the cultivated land, most of the tomb owners here were buried directly underneath their chapels. But there were a few exceptions. A few particularly important people, including some of the viziers or prime ministers, had small to actual burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings. And a few others had their burial chambers in other locations other than underneath their chapels. And this is the Sheikh Abdel Kerner Hill, which, in many ways, it was probably the place to be seen dead in during the 18th dynasty, particularly, with a lot of tombs clustering on the very highest elevations of the hill to allow them to get the best view possible of the passing processions which were running along the front here, particularly that of the beautiful Feast of the Valley. And here we've got a rather typical entrance to a tomb, just going back a second. Some of them, of course, have got pillared facades, but most of them are much simpler with a graded courtyard, a vertical cutting in the rock, and then here is the entrance to, well, in this particular case, tomb of Sennefer is the chapel, the public part of it. Not open to the public, and therefore to protect it from potential vandals, with stones built up in front of the iron door. But here, what is open to the public here is his burial chamber, which in this case is approached by a sloping passageway in one side of the courtyard. Some periods we find the entrance, say, is in the open courtyard. In some cases, the entrance to the substructure is inside the chapel itself. It's one of these various things which varies with time, and also to some degree, presumably, the desires of the tomb owner and his architect. The tomb chapels, as I say, are decorated. Mainly, at least in the earlier cases, with scenes to do with the production of food. Also here we've got a scene of hunting and fishing in the marshes. We've also here got scenes of the funeral and related things as well. No two tombs are identical. There are a lot of themes which we find in more than one tomb. And there are changes in fashion. That more ritual scenes start appearing in the middle of the 18th dynasty. And then quite remarkably, after the Amarna period, after the period where everything has been thrown up in the air by Akhenaten, when everything comes back down again, these sort of scenes of food production, hunting and fishing and so on, then just disappear from the tomb repertoire, which is really interesting. This is the tomb of Menena, which is one of the finest examples of a mid-18th dynasty tomb chapel. Most of these, for example, Menena here, are painted on plaster. This is a function of the poor quality rock high up on the Sheikh Abdel Kerner Hill. And here it was a trade-off clearly between having a tomb with a view and being able to go for the ideal in Egyptian tomb decoration, which was raised relief. Then, if you wanted to have raised relief, you had to have a tomb lower down without the same kind of view. And one of the people who decided to go for that compromise was Ramosa, one of the viziers, prime ministers of Amenhotep III. And here we just have one example of the absolutely exquisite carved relief decoration in his tomb. Never finished in the sense that it was never actually painted as the original intent would have been. The vizier died prematurely, but what they have done here is marked in the eyes in black ink, which gives a degree of vivacity to these, even without the bright colours which would have been put on had the tomb actually been completed. Then here we are back looking down at Ver Bahri, but what we want to look at here is over the other side of the mountain, which is where we find the famous Valley of the Kings. I say the Valley of the Kings is intimately linked with the memorial temples on the other side of the mountain, and in the case of Hatshepsut, her tomb is actually directly behind. Doesn't quite extend all the way underneath her temple, but very clearly the tomb and the temple are intimately linked. And here we are looking down into the Valley of the Kings from that ridge, which we're just looking at here. That photograph is basically taken from up here. We're looking down at some of the 64 tombs which are in the Valley of the Kings. The ones which we can see standing open here are among the later ones. Initially, there was a great attempt to try and hide the tomb from potential robbers. So the earliest tombs are in little corners like this is Amenhotep II's tomb over here. But as time went by, a desire for more monumentality sort of overtook the desire for security. Presumably, after long years of stability, it was thought that police patrols could probably keep these tombs secure, and therefore these ones of the 20th dynasty are huge openings, could never ever have been properly hidden. And indeed, after being robbed within a few decades of their being occupied, they then stood open right the way through into modern times. They've never actually been lost, unlike some of the earlier tombs, which have actually had to be excavated. The sheer complexity of the tombs under the mountain can be shown in this plan here, which is from the Atlas of the Valley of the Kings, published again by AUC Press, and see how close some of the tombs get together, and some indeed got too close. For example, we have a collision between two tombs here. We've got another collision between two tombs here, where while the later tomb was being excavated by the ancient workmen, it ran straight into the adjacent tomb. Today, of course, the valley has been very much tidied up for visitors. So with steps going down. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the level we're looking at here is much higher than the ancient level. Ancient flash floods, some of which we can trace archaeologically, filled up the level of the valley up to there. So, for example, the tomb of Tutankhamun here, the small tomb in the very centre of the valley, just here, just outside the tomb of Rameses IX, the 20th dynasty. You actually go down quite a significant distance within this modern enclosure to actually get down into the actual tomb itself. And here again, we can just see some modern steps have been put in, which occupy this great thick layer. And indeed, when you're walking around the valley, just walking along here, you look down from the side of the modern path, there's a great drop down to clearly what is the original natural level. The tombs here range from the early 18th dynasty. This is the tomb of Thutmose III, possibly one of the finest tombs in the valley in many ways, with this strange imitation papyrus decoration on its walls, drawn with a pen and ink on a previously prepared ground. Contrasting then with the brightly painted, elaborate reliefs to be found in the tombs of, say, Horemheb here of the end of the 18th dynasty, of Seti I, perhaps the most famous tomb in the valley, on the right there of the early 19th dynasty. And then we have the really intricate decoration of the 20th dynasty tombs. Again, the finest probably that of Rameses VI, with an astronomical ceiling and a bewildering range of theological works on its walls, reflecting increasing level of sophistication of funerary belief as we move through the New Kingdom. And then, in some ways contrasting with these monuments of the great and the good and great and not so good of Egyptian history, we have Deir el-Medina, the place where the people who actually made many of these great monuments lived. Although their primary job was to construct the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the Deir el-Medina workmen also undertook private commissions. They made coffins for people, and I'm sure that some of the nobles were able to obtain the use of some of these super skilled labourers. And also the workmen built their own tombs as well. And of course, as their day job was to build the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the quality of the decoration was such that it equaled that of a pharaoh. And indeed, in some of the cases, we can identify the same artist working in the Valley of the Kings as also working in Deir el-Medina as well. That the same person had been working during their working week in the royal tomb, and during their weekend off, they would be decorating their own tomb, or for their brother-in-law, their uncle, their father-in-law, or whatever else. Because the people who worked at Deir el-Medina were a mixed skill set, and clearly they would be able to share those skills amongst themselves to make sure that they themselves had the best possible tombs. And so, therefore, here we are looking down at the Deir el-Medina, and also looking off, as say, an old photograph showing the way that it was almost completely clear all the way down to the river back in the 1960s. Here, with just the colossi of Memnon visible, the new now re-erected temple colossi now still buried, the whole and all of the various buildings which run along here, the Memnon Hotel, the new Memnon Hotel, which is where I normally stay, which is just here, absolutely just pure, just nothing but fields, and all these other things which are different. So again, showing how the West Bank has changed. But so here we have the village itself, originally founded under Thutmose I, the first king to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, and then extended over the years. And one of the remarkable things about it, of course, is we can actually say who lived in some of these individual houses, and we can also say which tombs some of these people were working on. So a wonderful way of linking the remote past, but being able to almost make that remote past feel alive. And from the various documents which have been found in and around the village, we know all the various local scandals, who's sleeping with who, and all those kinds of things. So we can, one could almost write a soap opera for the TV based on some of what we know about the comings and goings of the workmen and their families here. Here we are again looking at these streets of houses. The end here is the mud brick wall surrounding a much later Hathor temple. But it was also at this far end of the village that the workmen had their own little chapels to worship their own local deities. And so, with this little view, looking over the fields of the West Bank with the various balloons, which are a feature of the early morning scene on the West Bank at Luxor, I will close my little my sort of brief guided tour of Luxor, and I'm of course happy to answer any questions you have about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dobson. This was very, very insightful. I'm sure everyone learned something about Luxor, like I did, a thing or two, I'm sure, that they don't know. And we did receive some questions. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read aloud some of them.
Feel
Keith
free.
asked has there been excavation where the axis between Karnak and Dir al-Bahari arrives on the West Bank? Presumably there must have been a dock there, presumably of some size and also constructed in stone. And he's following up with the question whether such a dock would now be underwater due to the change in the course of the Nile.
Yeah, we certainly know that the dock existed, and we know it was called Keftet Hernebes in ancient. We've got that in the text. However, the movements of the Nile mean that it's likely to be completely lost. People had then certainly going back for 100 years. People have sort of wondered where it might be, but the amount the river has moved over the years, say the river has moved nearly a kilometre from the Middle Kingdom to its current location, and even actually when you're looking at maps going back to the 19th century, there have been sort of tens of meters of movement. So it's likely that the West Bank docks are probably going to be deeply buried, or even under the river now, quite honestly. So yeah, and so the only place we can't actually pick up the processional route until we actually get onto the edge of the desert, virtually at the bottom of the Deir al-Bahri causeway.
Okay, interesting. Sharif is asking, he's saying, first, thank you for this rich webinar. I was just wondering about the main reason for building these great monuments. Is it just about worshiping goddesses and gods, or the queens and kings? And among all of these great temples, some people are asking, what is your favorite one?
Okay, right. The purpose of them. Okay, there's clearly got two different sorts of temple. They're the ones which are purely for the gods. Now, a god had to have a house, so therefore they're effectively the home of the god, and that is where they're looked after by their priests and so on. So that's your sort of normal temple, and with Karnak temple, really sort of a gigantic version of that, because although you've got all these various elements of Karnak, you've only actually got a limited. You've typically got the one god, Amun, in the main axis, plus Khonsu and some of the others. So that's really what that is. It's purely about the home of the god. But of course, as these temples have developed, they've also become important economic centers as well. So as well as being a religious, home of the god Amun, Karnak is also a major driver of the economy of the whole of Thebes. So it's the same way, I think, when you're looking at modern religious buildings, you're looking at monasteries, cathedrals, churches, mosques, and so on. They all have these rather things. And as far as the memorial temples, they are fundamentally about the long-term well-being of the dead king. The idea that they should receive offerings, either real offerings or those generated by the decoration. But so it's interesting in the way that the New Kingdom kings pair that with also a local version of Amun and other local versions of deities. So one wonders whether there's a sort of degree of trying to, in some way, trying to tie yourself to a god. So if people don't really want to remember you, they might still turn up to worship the version of Ammon, who happens to be on the site as well. So that's sort of that. As to my favourite, in some ways, I think, and it's in fact my favourite of the memorial temples, anyway, it's probably one which I didn't actually talk about tonight, except in passing, which is this little memorial temple of Seti I. At the northern end of the site. The reason why I like that is partly because very few people visit it. They should do, but it's one of the places on the West Bank where you're unlikely to be trampled on by about 3 buses worth of tourists. And you can certainly, it's been very badly ruined, but there's some exquisite decoration there, and the sort of the quiet of it, I think, gives you a nicer feel to it. than some cases which more beautiful places. And unfortunately, I know Deir el-Bahri is a wonderful place, but when you've got your 20th busload trampling by while you're trying to sort of to appreciate it, so there's a certain degree of that as well about it. But I think the jewel of the West Bank, which so few people visit, is probably the Kurna Temple of Seti I.
Okay. Well, that answers a lot of questions. Some people are asking also for about your memorable, and I had a question about the hidden gem, so I think that checks all marks. We've received a question from Tara Broadley. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She says, "Hello, Aidan. Nice to see you again. Met at the S10 conference. You are certainly right about the Karnak's impression being one renewed awe with each visit. The restoration project has revealed the vibrant colors hidden behind dust and dirt. Do you think the colors help to bridge the time gap between modern times and the ancient Egyptians in a way that changes our view of Karnak today and the people who built it?"
I think so, in a way, because when you certainly when I first came back to Karnak after they'd done the main bit of cleaning in the it changed the whole feel of it, because when everything is just simply sort of the sand coloured, it's all beautiful stuff, but there's a lack of vibrancy. But I remember when I walked into the Hyperstyle Hall a couple of years ago, when they just sort of revealed the first cleaned columns, it really did sort of, it was, even for, for a sort of rather jaded person who'd been there so many times, it was a wow moment. And the same goes for round in the Khonsu temple, where they've cleaned a lot of the walls as well. That suddenly something that was interesting suddenly it was much more immediate. The sort of the 3,000 years almost disappeared, because those were the colours which Seti I, Rameses II was seeing in these locations. So yes. So I think that kind of cleaning really it's not just simply something to be done. It really does change the whole feel of a structure.
Yeah. I haven't been in quite some time, so I think it's about time for me to go visit Luxor and
I
see
think so. 'Cause I think the way that they're now sort of they're working well through there. So there was a point where you could just sort of glimpse some of this around the scaffolding, but now they've actually got a lot of it done. So at least down the main axis, you've really got it. You've got the full benefit of it.
Great. I mean, this is a great invitation for everyone. Come and visit Luxor. It's
Yes, indeed.
a must see.
Yeah, because I was just saying to Suzanne
Yeah.
in February, we're taking a couple of friends who've never been to Egypt before, and it's going to be quite exciting to actually introduce them to Luxor in this kind of way.
Yes, I'm sure. And also, I want to let our viewers know, if you're in Egypt, we're planning an in-person event for the forthcoming book by Dr. Aidan Dodson and Hatshepsut. So you'll get an invitation for sure. Another question. So in your opinion, do you think there are still many monuments or tombs that are uncovered or still to be discovered in Luxor?
Oh yeah, I think as everywhere in Egypt there are. As I mentioned in passing, that recently an expedition has found what we think is the tomb of Thutmose II, which had been sought for years, and it was not found anywhere near where people thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And that these southern wadis where this project is working, I think there's a scope for an awful lot. We know that they've already found a number of things in that area, and that's the whole southern area has been very little visited. Howard Carter was the only person ever to have explored it until probably the last couple of decades, and so there's areas like that which really have almost been in terra incognita archaeologically, but also even in well-known sites. Now, for example, a new tomb was found in the Valley of the Kings only about 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, it was a small one, belonged to a princess and so on, but new tombs are even to be found there. And also, the other thing is also the identification of structures which previously were known, but we didn't actually know what they were. Like there's one ruined tomb which has recently been identified as the tomb of Amenhotep, son of Harpu, the great deified official of Amenhotep III. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount to be some of it's sort of hidden in plain sight almost. And there are some tombs which we know exist because they were seen by 19th century explorers, which have now been lost.
Oh,
Some of them we've got a vague idea of where they might be, and some of them actually been rediscovered. But there's still some which, it's particularly sort of intriguing where a tomb exists
yeah. It's like a
and
lot.
sort of where it is, but when you go there, is just so yeah. There's a lot more to be found, and as I say, the stuff like the this remote sensing, the drill cores I was talking about at Karnak, they've also been doing them on the West Bank as well, which again have helped elucidate where the river was running and where sort of monuments might yet be.
Okay. Um, we're running a little bit out of time, but there's another question that I just received from Sylvia Ismail. She's thanking you for the interesting webinar. And she's asking about if artists still work on the recording the frescoes and reliefs like Cleverly and Broom at Abydos in the past, or is everything now digital? So how do
Um,
we record the scenes in the temples and tombs now?
I think that there's still a lot of that artistry is being done, and I think a lot of the work now is sort of a mixture of digital and because even with the best scanners and all those sorts of things, there's still subtleties which only the human eye can make out. So, for example, Chicago House, which is the great sort of the doyen of epigraphic work in Luxor, is still working, and they now use a mixture of their old-fashioned kind of way of doing things with digital stuff as well. Um, and in fact, when often even if you've managed to capture something digitally, you may then take it away and look at it but then you want to go back before you publish anything. You'll want to go back to the monument to look at it as well. So there's, as I say, there's a mixture of things, and the digital stuff is often with a human in the loop. For example, it's you'll if you're tracing something, you'll be tracing it using a digital pen. You won't let the machine do it. It's still a human being who is tracing the images, but they're using the technology to make it easier rather than trying to muck around using ink and pencils in sort of 50-degree heat. It's sort of it's a mixed economy now, but still the artist is still a fundamental thing in the recording of these things, and that's crucial thing. That's crucial work to be done, because even now we're still getting occasionally things get vandalized, and so therefore, unless things are recorded, there's a danger of them being lost. Now, either vandalism or simply accident. No thing, one earthquake. We do get earthquakes in Luxor. Something may collapse, and unless it's been recorded, it's lost. So the epigraphy remains an absolutely crucial thing, and in some ways even more important than excavation. Some people have argued we should stop excavation until we've copied everything. They've been saying that for 100 years, but it's still a valid argument.
Well, I mean, if we keep going, I mean, we can go up to like 10. People are asking so many questions, but I mean, we have limited time, and I really want to thank you for all of your effort and time revising the book and also presenting it to our audience. And I'm sure people are gonna find it so much insightful like me. Make sure to pre-order the book. Is about to be released 1st of October worldwide. But I just want to ask you about your forthcoming book, if you want to let us know what it's about and what people can expect in your in-person talk in February, inshallah.
Okay, well, so the next one, as people are aware, I've been writing a number of books in this Lives and Afterlives series. And the basic concept of the book is half of the book is talk about the straight history of the people's lives, their monuments, and so on. But the other half takes afterlife in two different ways. One is literally their religious afterlife. So that section is talking about their tombs, and funerary monuments and so on. So this particular one, there's a large amount on Der al-Bahri, of course, and I showed you one of the images from that. But then there is their other afterlife, which is how they have been regarded by posterity, their own posterity, the ancient Egyptians themselves, how people, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut were remembered. And we know that about 300 years after their deaths, a priest king of Luxor named two of his children after them. So even though that people are aware that Thutmose III tried to write Hatshepsut out of history, actually a few centuries, the two of them are regarded as being a set, very much we regard as set nowadays. And then on from there, their afterlife in modern times, how they were rediscovered by modern Egyptologists, different views on what was happening in their reigns, how those views have changed over time. Because I said right at the beginning that ancient Egyptian history is very much a movable feast, and that what people thought about Hatshepsut and Thutmose in the 19th century is very different from what we thought about them, think about them now, and what were thought to be facts then and now know not to be facts, what I call zombie facts, things which were a perfectly good idea on the basis of the evidence available in like 1850, but now in 2024 we know that's no good. Yet because some of those ideas were publicized and found their way into into encyclopedias and things like that, although Egyptologists know that these ideas are completely dead, they're still out there, and you have, and people, tourists, tour guides will still quote them back at you, and hence the reason why I call them zombies. Very dead, but almost impossible, but still alive and difficult to kill.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, we're looking into dates in mid-February, so make sure to follow AUC Press to know about the actual date and to receive the invitation. We're planning to have the talk about the book Hotness and Hatshepsut on in Ewart Hall at AUC Tahrir campus. So make sure to attend. And again, I really am so thankful for your time and your effort, Dr. Aidan. It's very insightful for everyone and for me in particular. And I really enjoy hosting you and moderating the talks with you. And I'm sure others feel the same. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us today, took the time of the day to listen to this wonderful lecture, and also to assure them that the recording is going to be available right after on our Facebook page, AUC Press, and shortly on our YouTube channel, AUC Press, as well on YouTube. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Dodson. If you want to like to say a few last words before we end.
Well, just thank you for having me. I'm glad to have been able to present on the book, and also just to give give people a view, my view of sort of Luxor and the area like that. So I would just say shukranawi. Until next time, and masalama.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you.